stent in pediatric age group is about 50%. That's the research that I did over last night to see approximately 50% is the patency rate, primary patency rate, and it's about 60 to 70% a secondary patency rate. So what are the problems that one encounters in TIPS procedure in a pediatric age group? It is technically difficult, basically because obviously the portal veins are very small. To actually blindly puncture a portal vein in an adult is not that easy, and then that too in a child with nearly half the size of the portal vein, it is even more difficult. And the frequency of re-intervention seems higher as compared to that of adults. So giving you just a picture showing you what a TIPS is, you have gone into the right hepatic vein. Preferably we prefer the right hepatic vein to do a TIPS, but for some reason you don't have access to the right hepatic vein, you can go into the left hepatic vein. Your idea is to go from the right hepatic vein into the right portal vein and create the shunt. If you cannot, then you go from the left hepatic vein into the left portal vein and create the shunt. God forbid you don't have any veins available, then what we call a DIPS procedure is direct IVC to portal vein stent placement. So this is the right hepatic vein. We have entered into the right hepatic vein, punctured with a Chiva needle and entered into the portal vein. We've confirmed that we're in the portal vein, balloon dilated the passage, and finally put in a stent graft, and that is the result of a TIPS procedure. So the basic take-home message is, if you can treat the patient with a less invasive procedure like a hepatic vein plasty, it is always better than at a final stage when you do a TIPS procedure. Thank you.
There are very few tasks that you look forward to and you worry about, and talking about storage disorders, especially when such a fantastic talk has been given about hepatosplenomegaly and fever by Dr. Amdekar, is a very, very daunting task. So thank you, Abha, for allowing me to talk on this approach to the storage diseases. So this is what inherited metabolic disorders is all about, and I'm going to go through each and every pathway until you fall asleep. I promise you, okay? But the reason I put up this slide is because I do not know any of these cycles. I do not expect you to know any of these cycles, but at the same time, it is a complex pathway, and we need to try and simplify it and see how we can get to that. So inherited metabolic diseases are either because there is a deficiency of the enzyme and there is a toxic metabolite, or either there is a deficiency of the enzyme and there is storage material that is accumulated in the various tissues of the body. So I think that's important to differentiate between the two. And what we are going to do today is talk about storage material which is being accumulated in different tissues in the body. So I'm not going to address anything related to some of the pathways that I highlighted on my first slide, you'll be pleased to know. And the main storage disorders that we talk about are the lysosomal storage disorders, because lysosomes are the main organelles within the cell which help in the excretion of some of this material and the transport of some of this material. And they can be grouped by a class of the main substrates stored into glycogenesis or lipidosis. And then you have the glycosaminoglycans, which is the mucopolysaccharidosis and oligosaccharidosis. And these are rare disorders. The incidence of these disorders are around 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 300,000. So you probably will see them once every few years if you have a busy private practice. And what is the key is to pick up these amongst the other causes of hepatosplenomegaly, and I really envy you, because that's a big challenge really in these situations. They present in three types. One of them are the silent disorders, which are the most difficult to assess, because they are subtle, they are silent, and you need to have a high index of suspicions. Acute metabolic crisis, even I can recognize, so no points for that. And neurological deterioration is something which we all know about, which points towards a metabolic disorder, especially in children with delayed milestones or regression of milestones. There are some warning signs when you take history or you do examination, which probably can help you to think, is this a storage disease? And these are some of the signs. The difficulty always is that some of these signs do overlap with other common disorders, and that's really where the challenge is. And I think you have to please look for common things commonly before you think of a storage disease. You have to first exclude the reasons for hepatosplenomegaly first, rather than go and look for storage disorders in the first instance. Only when you have excluded the common causes can you think about whether this could be a storage disease. And amongst them, the ones that really point towards a storage disease, I feel, are consanguinity and regression of milestones hypotonia, and then that goes into the neuronal ceroid lipofuscinosis and other disorders which I'm not going to talk about today, because this is exclusively localized to the liver. Most of these children, because there is storage material, will have the storage material stored in the liver, the spleen, the muscle, or the bone marrow. And these are conditions which have been taught by Barjor Bharucha, the late Barjor Bharucha, about how you assess the hepatomegaly, whether it's a splenomegaly with hepatomegaly or whether it's a massive hepatomegaly with mild to moderate splenomegaly. And it's important to make this distinction on clinical examination, which will help you guide towards the possibility of a diagnosis. So if you have a massive splenomegaly with a mild hepatomegaly, please do think about portal hypertension first before you think about Gaucher's and before you think about leukemias first. But if you have a massive hepatomegaly with mild to moderate splenomegaly, possibility is that glycogen storage disease is a possibility, although you can never exclude portal hypertension even in that situation. Firm, hard liver, these are the causes which are there. Again, galactosemia usually presents in the liver failure setting in the neonatal period. So, a clinical diagnosis is very essential, confirmed by usually enzyme estimation. And a soft liver with splenomegaly is more pointers towards a storage disorder. So I think there are two things that you have to take home. One is, like Abha said previously, if you have a massive splenomegaly with mild hepatomegaly and you have excluded a liver cause, then possibility of Gaucher's disease, and it is important to recognize that because it is easily treatable. And the second thing is, if you have a hepatomegaly which is softer in consistency but not a big spleen, then possibly a lysosomal storage disorder is a possibility. You have to obviously examine other systems, and you all know about the mucopolysaccharidosis and sialidosis and mucolipidosis, which have associated coarse facial features. There are other markers such as cardiac and renal abnormalities which can be seen in glycogen storage diseases, and especially you need a good ophthalmologist who can look for cherry red spots and thus confirming the diagnosis of some of the lysosomal disorders. What blood test do you do? Because this gets asked again and again. What blood test do you do apart from the routine? And it again depends on what your clinical examination, what your history is, and what the pointers are towards. I think one of the key tests that you can do in these children is a blood glucose sometimes and a blood gas, really as a first line in your lab practice. But when you request for them, these are the type of tests that we can do. I know that I've put in chitotriosidase, but that's something which we commonly do in Birmingham Children's Hospital because we feel that it's a sensitive indicator for particularly Niemann-Pick type C, and it's not widely available. It's at the present we are in the process of validating it, so don't go for that. But a simple plasma glucose, plasma lactate is quite essential in children with an isolated hepatomegaly or a hepatosplenomegaly, and then you can proceed to other enzyme estimations and hepatosplenomegaly profiles which are available. I think it is important to consider a bone marrow aspirate sometimes rather than a liver biopsy, depending on what your condition you're trying to exclude, because a liver biopsy, as you all know, can be a dangerous procedure, while a bone marrow is a relatively simple procedure to do and can identify or give you the diagnosis because you can see the storage cells in it. I'll talk in the next 3 minutes, I promise, about few conditions, and then I'll end the talk well ahead of schedule and give you ample time to ask all the burning questions that you have in your mind about storage diseases. But in the Gaucher's disease, you've got the type 1 and the type 3 and a type 2 which is intermediate. And this is the disease that I want to really concentrate upon, because although this is rare, if you can diagnose it, you are privileged in this city that you have our enzyme replacement therapy available at no extra cost. We have to pay through our teeth and nose and mouth for it in the NHS for the enzyme replacement therapy in Gaucher's. And usually, they present with isolated splenomegaly and anemia and just mild hepatomegaly sometimes as well. And the key thing is that these children have abdominal pains and bone pains because they have this material stored in the various tissues. It can present anywhere from infancy to infancy to adulthood, and the type 3 is the intermediate severity, but it has got neurological manifestations. And the Niemann-Pick disease, I find this disorder really challenging, because when do you suspect it in a child with neonatal cholestasis with hepatosplenomegaly, when we know that some of the chronic liver diseases that you see in the neonatal population can have hepatosplenomegaly as well. And the neurological symptoms don't come right at the start, they come later on. So I think that's where the challenge is in these children. Is we usually, if there is a splenomegaly which is disproportionate to the degree of chronicity of the liver disease, we usually do a bone marrow aspirate at the same time as a liver biopsy to check for any storage material which is present within these children. And usually these children have got a very poor prognosis and die by 2 to 3 years of age. The other thing that we do in these children is always take a skin biopsy and then send it for fibroblast culture, because you can get Philippine staining and confirmation of type C Niemann-Pick disease in these children. And some of the families can be misled into the fact that the condition is improving, because in some of these children the neonatal cholestasis improves, but then starts the double insult of a neurological insult and then further neurological deterioration, and the child can really die by 5 years of age. Glycogen storage diseases are many, and they are growing in number as we speak, but the main ones which are localized to the liver are the type 1, type 3, type 4, type 6, type 9 and type 11. We won't go through all of them, but what is key in these is that the liver is involved in most of them, but at the same time you have to look for hypoglycemia, and hypoglycemic episodes can lead to long-term brain damage, and that's something which we all need to understand and make sure that that is prevented, and avoid prolonged periods of starvation, or give some cornstarch if you have easy access to cornstarch. So prevention of hypoglycemia is key to all these conditions of glycogen storage disease. Not all of these conditions have hypoglycemia, but it's quite commonly seen in type 1. It can be occasionally seen in type 11 and very subtly in type 6. And the type 6 ones are the ones which are always difficult to diagnose, because they are not overt hypoglycemic episodes which are there. Wolman disease is a disease of what I call is a postgraduate MD disease, because you diagnose it on the ward when you do an abdominal X-ray and you see adrenal calcification, and the child has been admitted with vomiting and failure to thrive and hepatosplenomegaly. And I still remember one of my seniors making that diagnosis on the ward on my first month of my MD pediatrics, and I still to this day remain impressed with that diagnosis that was made. But it's a sad disease, because these children really die by 3 to 6 months of age. There's another subtle form of it which is cholesterol ester storage disease, which gets manifested in adulthood, but usually comes with xanthelasma and hyperlipidemia, and there are replacement therapies available for most of these diseases. There is now fascinating experience now being developed in substrate reduction therapy, and enzyme replacement therapy. So there is a lot to look forward for the diagnosis of storage diseases and the treatment of storage diseases. Liver transplantation is usually reserved for GST type 1, and in GST type 1 non-A, really, there is inflammatory bowel disease and there can be kidney involvement. So timing of the liver transplantation is very important in these children, and there are, it is quite important to do early transplantation sometimes with poor metabolic control, but this will continue to require GCSF in the post-transplant period, and a good cardiac evaluation and recurrent is necessary before liver transplantation. So I think, just as a parting thought, metabolic diseases are individually very, very rare, but as a group are not uncommon. So you need to have a high index suspicion. The presentations in the neonate can be very non-specific in the outset, and if you're struggling with a child where you've done everything, you can't think of anything, this hepatosplenomegaly, please do think of a storage disease. Now more and more are being treatable, but the most difficult step in the diagnosis is considering the possibility. So thank you very much for your attention.
Hi once again. I was saw to it that besides the panel, the two topics that she gave me was not something very common, and it's something interesting because I guess PEG is percutaneous endoscopy gastrostomy. In touchwood, I am the one who started doing it in newborns, and I've done around 46 or something total PEGs in children. So when I did the first PEG, I was trying to read a lot about it, and nobody ever gave a talk of PEG to me except in some nutrition conferences. So it's quite interesting to know that Abha could think about this. Now, simple, like just, I'm assuming very, very thin people here, so I'm not going to talk great, but this is a topic from exam point of view, and PGs may be interested. Enteral nutrition is something that you want to give it in the GI tract through not the oral route, so you either put in a tube or something alternatively. So the main funda for that is obviously the GI tract should be functioning. That is the main funda. So when do you want to give it? You want to give it when you're not happy with either the intake, so the growth is not adequate, so the amount of calories that you're providing is not good, like we were talking about biliary atresia, and the cholestatic liver diseases. So I use a lot about enteral nutrition. And then when you feel the intake of the patient that is not adequate, that means I want to give so much amount of fluid and so much amount of calories, and I'm not able to do that orally. So then again I need to resort to this method. Then they say that we get so engrossed with our patients in the critical care and the management of this, we just forget about the enteral nutrition so many times. So it should be good that someone in the unit keeps reminding the other persons that what about the nutrition, because I keep telling that jab tak khurak nahi ho to you can't treat from head to toe. You need a good nutrition to fight anything, any sepsis infection or something. So you should think about when you're not able to feed your child for say around 7 days or so, for whatever reason the patient is in the ICU, somebody should be there to think about nutrition. And for some reason there's trauma to the mouth, or I had issues with cleft palate, I had patients with swallowing difficulties and all those where I had to use them. So I mean, just incriminating a little bit, these you could go on the net and see diseases, but it's like common sense. When do you need it? In GI diseases, like in patients with IBD, short bowel, diarrhea, extrahepatic biliary atresia, pseudo, liver diseases, and glycogen storage diseases, which he was talking. I remember seeing the first PEG when I was in 97 in Birmingham, where I had a child with this, and I was wondering why it was, because obviously this child would get hypoglycemic, so it was ensured that he had some sort of access to this. So that's a way, even in the night, overnight feeding or something you want to do. So that child was having a PEG for that. And then in preterm, all of us get these issues. We usually give a lot of tube feedings. Neurologically, patient, anything, whether encephalitis, meningitis, tuberculosis, hand injury, patients with tumors, then again, you need a nutrition for that. And cardiac patients, sometimes when you have a good supporting cardiac unit, they want to do surgery on a child, and they want your child to be around 6-8 kg. So I get a reference for them to nutritionally improve this child so that they are able to take for the surgery in these, because the child gets breathless and is not able to take a decent amount of calories for that. Then this was only one patient among all that I did, was a patient who was on, a post-malignancy chemotherapy, and so his appetite had really gone very bad. We all know that chemotherapy can take away the appetite. So it was a hepatoblastoma, and then he was on chemotherapy. So I thought maybe I could give him PEG to improve the nutritional status. So sometimes we need to do that. And then the hypometabolic region and ventilated sick, etc. So that was talking about the nutrition. And again, a key word, you need to give some amount of nutrition to the gut so that it prevents the NEC and all that, even in patients that you're talking about, sick patients in the ICU. So when can you not consider enteral nutrition? That is obviously when the GI tract is not working, so that's, it's not possible for me. So is there any obstructions, a mechanical, a paralytic thing, or there is a perforation or an, necrosis in the gut? So these, or peritonitis, so these, or massive ascites, so these are the conditions where it is not possible for us to probably access these things. And this, intestinal dysmotility, so these are the other conditions. So when you talk about the enteral nutrition, obviously you need to keep assessing the patient, the clinically and the biochemically. Now there are certain scenarios when you get stuck. We all talk about weight for height and all to decide acute on chronic, but for liver disease patient, it gets very difficult for us to, to just take these things into consideration because of ascites and edema, because of a big liver, spleen, etc. So we believe in taking this triceps skin fold. That gives us a better idea about the nutrition rather than the other thing. And there are studies to show that that was superior to the mid-arm muscle circumference followed by the weight and height. So in order of frequency that way. Then obviously you would want to know the status biochemically when you're giving nutrition. So you look into all this. You keep having your function test, acid, base, and proteins, etc. that you are looking into when you're looking into, just like you look into the PN part of it. And then having decided to give that, you need to know what formula to give. How do you want to give? Do you want to give it with a tube feed, or you think it is going to be more than 3-4 weeks that you're going to need nutrition? Then might as well go for PEG. But if you need it for a short time, couple of weeks, then I would suggest tube feeds only rather than going for it. So you want to, how do you want to deliver it? What sort of a monitoring? So these are the next question. Now, talking about the feeding solutions in India, we mostly resort to kitchen feeds. We try to get in a good basis with the dietitians, get about the nutrition and the feeds. You decide. In a liver patient, we were talking about MCT. For giving MCT, coconut oil is the best way you can provide MCT. So I use 2/3 of my cooking oil in liver disease patients with coconut oil. So there are various ways that you do, but yes, you will have a little problem calculating the osmolality and all that stuff. It gets very difficult. So if you feel the patient is not tolerating, then you decide. Now we do have formulas if we are treating preterm, lactose-free, high-calorie we do get formulas available in the market for this. But sometimes what I do is, like in the daytime you want to use the kitchen feeds, and in the night it gets very difficult to get up and do things, and so we prefer to use the formula feeds or something in the night so that it gets more convenient for the parents to manage this. And again, as I said, we do get some special formulas for that. And in MCT, to be honest, in India, the maximum we get is up to 30%. And the modular feeds, when I was in England, I was pretty impressed. The dietitian used to come and used to ask us, what do you want, how much carbohydrate and this, and they used to go and prepare modular feed. I tried my best to learn, but it was just not possible because they have various ways of making those formula feeds. Whether you want to talk about an HFI patient or anyone, they could make modular feeds for them. So how do you want to give it? What is the site or the route? So you would either use the nasogastric, nasoduodenal, nasojejunal. For example, a patient with pancreatitis. Now, I don't want to give nasogastric. I would like to give nasojejunal because I want to bypass that area of stimulation. So then if there is some issues with some motility issues, then I would, again want to bypass that and decide where to give. If there is patients like small patients with reflux disease from the nursery, I get calls, and I would rather want them to be fed nasoduodenal so that I'm able to avoid the reflux issues with them. And then the PECs which we do is most of the time I've done only the gastrostomies, the stomach gastrostomies, And the jejunostomies, the surgeons used to be doing, but now it's quite nice to see the interventional radiologists doing it under the ultrasound guidance, and they're able to put small 14, 16 French tubes for us for feeding in the jejunum when you have a malnourished, like I had recently a child with DJ obstruction and extremely malnourished for us, already undergone 2 surgeries, so I wouldn't want him to go for another surgery quickly. So the routes which most of the time we all have been using this right from our, early days, nasogastric tube feeding. This is the best way, it's easiest, least expensive. When you want short-term feeding, this is the way we use. And we all have become expert in putting a blind tube insertion into a nasogastric. But please remember, I've had instances where the tube is actually in the esophagus and you did a chest x-ray, So make it a point whenever a patient is on tube feeds, while you're examining, make it a habit to see what centimeter is it at the nose. So at least you would know that it is not pulled out, unless it is coiled. Now the coiling thing is only at the first time when you put it. So if you put it, you've checked the position, it is straight, it won't coil after that in the foot pipe. So at that time you have to just ensure that it is not out. But because they say that tube malposition rates in children are quite high, and it could be, you must do a radiology to get to see where you've placed it. And the complications could be the same thing, obviously the local discomfort, tube puffs, all these things you could end up with the tubes too. Now gastrostomy, as a general rule, when you think that the feeding is going to be required for more than 3 weeks, then rather than going for a tube feeds, please proceed for gastrostomies. I have had patients with fistulas like corrosive lead poisoning, lead battery. They took a battery and it was a tracheoesophageal fistula or something. So the best thing I did is did a PEG and allowed it to heal. We saved a thoracic surgery for that patient. So the modes is either you want to give bolus feeding, or you want to give continuous feed, or you want to give just night feeding. Like Girish was saying, we do use night feeding for patients with liver disease. So you want to utilize the 12 hours in the night where the patient is not feeding, because just using the 12 hours is not fair enough. Continuous is a little difficult. We just only the patients who don't. Otherwise, majority of us resort to intermittent or that. The advantages is it preserves the gut integrity, and it decreases the bacterial dislocation, immunological function, low cost, safe, effective. So there's so many more advantages over parenteral nutrition. But yes, there are some disadvantages. When I said calculating kitchen feeds, etc., you may not be able to achieve the nutritional needs that you're able to look. And trust me, it is really very less acceptable to patients. I tried to, so many times, like pre-transplant patients, I want to put them on the tube feeds, especially those who are a little grown up. There is a total denial in the patients. Young patients, they still do. They just don't want to go it. So there is a less acceptability to patients, especially in India. There it was a habit. Everybody is moving in the wards with the tube feeds. It's not so difficult. And so we do have certain complications associated with that. And talking about the PEG, what is PEG? It was a novel approach where you bring the hollow viscous to the wall without laparotomy, without a stitch. It is not the same as a surgical gastrostomy. Indications are the same as that I was talking about, the enteral nutrition, wherever you want to use for more than 3 time, and the techniques are 2. We usually resort, these are the bolts and nuts. I'm going to show a video in the end, how do we do it. And the complications, usually we see the minor complications like erythema infection. Infection in our setting was 4%. And major complications can also be there if you could end up with a perforation or something. So you do have to keep this in mind, and only people who are experienced in doing PEGs should do, especially in children. It does have a lot of complications if it is not done. This is just to tell you we have enough literature in children to show that PEGs are very effective, and we have literature in newborns to show that they have been used. When I did my first newborn in India, that was almost 8 years back, the child did very well because of the nutrition that we could provide to the child, and the patient was on BPD and other issues. So for whatever you want to be successful, nutrition is very important in everything. This was only up to the 2006 data that I'm giving you. We had done by that time 26, and we did as early as 25 days. And we used only pull techniques. This is the smaller babies, you have to use 14 French. Otherwise, we use the other. Most of the time, it was for, head and injuries and all that stuff that are neurological cases. Very rarely I used it to improve the calorie intake like in the patient with chemotherapy. And we use antibiotics for 3 days and offsite dressing so that we're able to see them. We use kitchen feeds and formula, especially in the night, and we resort to intermittent feeding. The same precautions that you take for tube feeding has to be taken, you know. Don't keep the patient lying down when you want to feed just because there's a peg. The same precautions need to be taken, and we've had no major complications, but minor, especially in the form of infection. Once we had a nosocomial infection, and that was a nightmare requiring antibiotics. So you've got to be quite careful. And a lot of children that we've done, that's what I'm just trying to show the photographs on that. And I'll end it up with a video, please. So that was a small child. As you can see that most of them maybe, you know, like this child is on tracheostomy, there are issues and the swallowing is not there, so I had to give it for this. And so that is the, these are the, you obviously would want to just have a partial sedation. You need a good team of people there. Then you get in, I'm trying to see the foot pipe, then I saw the stomach, then this is the pylorus. You just need to have a quick examination to rule out any, वापस वो video कैसे होगा? Oh, it's coming, I'm so sorry. And then you point out from there, the light is going in the stomach. From there, I'm able to decide. So my scope is in the stomach, and that's the needle I'm putting in. With the needle, with the forceps, then we put in a wire through the tube that we had put. That was the wire, and then this is the wire we are putting in. Now the same wire, I'm going to hold it from inside. So that's how we hold the wire from the inside. And obviously when I'm doing this, I have to have a good anesthetist or a good guide who's doing the resuscitation, and I don't have to be looking into that part. And having done that, then once the wire has come out, we knot this. This is the PEG tube. This is the plastic tube. This is the knot we put. It is like 2 ends with, you know, like dead ends. So this is how, if you pull it, that's the knot, right? So having done the knot, now when I pull from here and I put it from the mouth, obviously that thing is going to enter and come out. You've got to give the right incision, just the right incision, to be making sure that it's neither too small and neither too big. Otherwise, you know, it's going to come out. If it's too tight, there's going to be ischemia too. So you decide where to cut it, and then this is the PEG tube you want to put there to support that, and that's it. So we've cut it, and we will be able to feed. That is the feeding tube. You connect to that, and you can use it for 6 months. You have now very smarter ones like the small ones. This is the first time we get balloon replacement tube. Balloon replacement is not so small. They are very small ones which you can. So life has become quite easy with the help of PEGs and the button replacement, especially for patients who are neurologically handicapped. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, I'm not going to talk about Wilson's in general because I was told to talk on what's new. So let me just concentrate on a few things that have come up in the last few years regarding Wilson's disease. But you can't start without knowing what Wilson's disease really is. Basically, this is a normal copper metabolism, to put it very briefly. Copper comes from your stomach, intestines, taken by the blood to the liver, in the liver used up for your enzymes, excess amount of copper bound to ceruloplasmin going to other tissues, more amount of copper going via the bile into your gut and excreted through your intestines. And this is where the problem in Wilson's disease is. The problem is not that you are eating more copper. The problem is that excess of copper in your liver is not getting bound to ceruloplasmin, so that it cannot go to the other tissues, cannot be excreted in the bile and into the gut, so obviously it's accumulating in the particular liver. Why this is important is as we go on, we will see that this is where the newer things are coming up. Well, we know it requires a very, very high index of suspicion, and the original teaching was any child or an adult between the ages of 5 to 35 or 5 to 40 who has anything like either a hepatic or a neurological findings should suspect Wilson's disease. Over the last few years, the age range has come down to 3 and gone up to 55. Reason being, over the last 5 years, many adults with neurological problems, so-called reported as Parkinson's, have now been re-diagnosed to have Wilson's disease. The oldest group is a family of 2 brothers. One was 50 and one was 55, both of whom were diagnosed to have Wilson's disease. So what is new is the fact that it is coming younger, which initially was thought not to be less than 5 years. It's now well reported at 3 years, and also the age is of 55. And I'm sure as time goes on, we will have problems, or more, the age is going to get more extended. When you talk about the diagnosis, this is what we have been told. Ceruloplasmin, urinary coppers, pre and post penicillamine, liver copper, serum copper, and free copper. What's new in this? Well, nothing really much new in this, except for the fact that if you see the new recent AASLD guidelines, they tell you that a ceruloplasmin less than 5 milligrams per deciliter or its equivalent is a very, very strong indicator of Wilson's disease even by itself. We always say that none of these tests are really diagnostic by itself. You require something else. But the suggestion here is that the lower the ceruloplasmin, especially if it's 1, 2, 3, this is very, very likely that this child has Wilson's disease. So if your other tests are not corroborating, please look a little more in detail. What about urinary copper? We were long told less than 40 is normal. In Wilson's disease, you require more than 100. More and more cases, especially in the West, are now getting diagnosed and recognized with having urinary coppers of only 70 and 80. So if you are doing a urinary copper estimation by a very, very sensitive method, that is atomic absorption spectrophotometry, it is now suggested by the recent guidelines that any urinary copper more than 40 should be made suggestive of Wilson's disease, not wait for 100. What about the post-penicillamine? We use it very commonly in pediatrics. This is one of the few tests where a test is primarily used in pediatrics, not validated in adults. However, we need to remember there again that its sensitivity is really good when a child is suffering from a liver disease, but really in the situation where we have a problem that is asymptomatic siblings, this is not such a great test. Free copper. A lot of data coming out about free copper. First thing you need to remember is you cannot measure free copper. It is a formula and a calculation. No biochemical test measures it right now. How do you calculate it? You calculate your total serum copper in milligrams per deciliter. From that you subtract your ceruloplasmin level, whatever you have, into 3.3. For example, if your serum copper is 20 or 25, your ceruloplasmin is 3, 3 times 3 is 9, 25 minus 9 is equal to your free copper. So it is a formulation which is now used primarily for follow-up rather than for diagnosis, and we'll be coming to that. A thing I want to concentrate on is the interpretation of urinary copper in Wilson's disease, because this is where I see many people have issues understanding what it means. When you have made a diagnosis of Wilson's disease and started this child on either penicillamine or triandine, any chelator, it is expected in the first year after treatment that your urinary copper goes up high, because all the excess copper of the child is coming out. So you can have 1000, 2000,